and never lets go. Amen? A preacher was completing a series of preaching opportunities on temperance. I would call that on booze. And he would say with great expression and passion, if I had all the beer in the world, I'd take it and I'd throw it in the river. And with even greater emphasis, he said, if I could take all the wine in the world, I would take it and I would throw it into the river too. And finally he said, if I could gather up all the whiskey in the world, I'd take that and I would throw that as far in the river as I possibly could. And he sat down, finishing his strong sermon. The choir director nervously stood up and cautiously announced, with a little bit of a smile, for our closing song, let us sing and join us, Shall We Gather at the River? Yeah, life is like that. I am so glad you're with me this morning. I just got back from a middle school, high school weekend with about 2,000 students learning about apologetics. Everybody say apologetics? It's simply the idea of how do you defend your faith. If someone has a question, can you defend it? And getting away with 2,000 high school and middle school students is craziness, right? But it was better than listening to the news and everything else that was going on. It was a huge blessing. So I'm so glad you're here today. If today is your first Sunday, welcome. If today is your 100th Sunday, you're always welcome here. I believe that God has brought you here today for a reason. That the message that we're to hear today is for you. There's something in it for you today. And I want you to pay attention and decide how I'm going to respond to what God's speaking into your life today. So let's dig in. We're in the middle of walking through the Gospel of Mark, keeping up with Jesus as he goes from place to place to place to place, and he moves quickly, right? He's always on the move. The Gospel's filled with this phrase, immediately, over and over again. Jesus doesn't seem to ever take a break. And right now we're at Mark chapter 5, verse 1 through 20. So if you have your pew Bible, open that up if you want to read along. That's the NRSV, or you can follow me on screen. What I know about this passage, starting out, is that it's connected to what just happened. Does anybody remember what just happened? What did we talk about last week? He calmed the storm, right? He calmed the storm, and he promised to get him to the other side. Good, you're still with me. That's excellent. So let's read through this, and then we're going to dig in and learn a little bit from it. Here we go. They, Jesus and the disciples, came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Say that with me. Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, what's that word? Immediately, like the moment they hit the shore, a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with chains, for he had been often restrained with shackles and with chains, but the chains he wrenched them apart, and the shackles he broke into pieces, and no one had enough strength to subdue him. Scary guy, right? Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. Pitiful guy. His situation is horrible. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." Where Jesus had already said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" Now, sometimes you could do some dramatics here, and you could play up the whole Legion thing. I'm just going to read it straight through. He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine. Let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank of the sea and were drowned in the sea. And the swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and they saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. They began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, this is one of those stories in Scripture that many of us have heard over and over again. If you've heard this story before, say, "I have." If it's your first time, just nod. This is my first time. I don't want to call you out. I think there are days when we've all experienced storms, right? And sometimes those storms come and they're scary, and then they go. Something happens. God steps in, and boom, he calms the storm. See, the sea goes flat. Everything's good. But then there are other times where there are seasons where the storm doesn't cease, where it seems to rage on. Have you experienced that? Those long-term struggles? If you have, say, "I have." Sometimes we feel like we've been forgotten or even left behind. We feel completely disconnected from any community. Have you ever felt like that? Disconnected? Just me? It's just me? Thanks, team. It's a feeling of hopelessness. It's a feeling that the situation that you're in is never going to change. It's never going to get better. It's no longer just an urgent crisis. It's a crisis that you're living in. And that's where the man is in the story. See, in the story, we encounter the demoniac, and Mark points out that he was already raging by the time Jesus stepped out of the boat. And so in our pastor study on Wednesday, I asked the team, how is it that this guy who's possessed and in the hills could know that it was Jesus coming? You want to know what their answer was? Well, like all the pictures, they have a picture of Jesus with a bright little halo. He could see him out in the water. They could spot that. I said, well, that's a decent answer. But I think that Jesus went across the other side just for this man. Just for this man. And at the moment he got out of the boat, the crazy man comes running out of the hills, naked, bruised, dirty, cut up, broken shackles on ankles, screaming at the top of his lungs, barely looking human. The disciples are like, I'm so glad I get to get out of this boat because just an hour ago we almost died. And you get out of the boat and all of a sudden comes running down the aisle, crazy. You know what the disciples said? Let's go get back in the boat. There's a lot to teach from this passage. You can talk about the power of God on display. Only God has the ability to disrupt evil like he does in this story. You could talk about political pigs. One of the questions I've always asked is, what about the pigs, Jesus? Why are you doing that to pigs? That's a sad day for bacon. Right? Why? And I learned a little bit about what was going on in that area, that the Roman legion that was occupying the Decapolis simply means the 10 cities. The Roman legion that was occupying the Decapolis at that time, their symbol, their sigil, was a wild boar. So as Jesus sends the pigs into the wild boar, the pigs, he is stating, I have power not only over evil spirits, but I'm showing I've got power over those boars. I've got power over the Romans as well. Demons. You can talk about demons in this sermon. And 3 to 6,000 are included in a legion. Not just a simple single casting out of one little demon. He casts out an entire army of demons, and he does it without a sweat. But what I want to talk about is none of those guys. I want to talk about the man that Jesus came for. Because that's what this story is about. It's about how encountering the disruptive love of God changes people. Jesus left the crowd for him. Jesus got in the boat for him. Jesus and the disciples faced the storm for him. It's not about the demon. It's about Jesus. Now, in the story, since we are talking about a little bit of the demoniac, I want you to understand something. Because people get this idea wrong all the time. Some people think that if Jesus and Satan were to have an arm wrestling match, it would be like a close match, right? Because Satan works out. He doesn't miss arm day, right? But in reality, you cannot make the devil small enough compared to the greatness of Jesus. You cannot make the devil small enough when you're trying to compare him to Jesus. He has no power. See, I get to encounter people every day trying to figure out their lives. And in my conversation with people, they've often gotten parts of their lives confused. It almost always boils down to 3 different ideas. What's my identity? Where do I belong? And what's my purpose? What's my identity? Where do I belong? And what's my purpose? In our student ministries, we teach our kids this to address these things. We want these things as solid as possible because it's going to tie back into this second. We tell them this: your identity is this: I am created to pursue an authentic relationship with my Creator. Every week the kids say this. Points out their identity. The second thing we tell them is, I belong to Jesus Christ and I define who I am by what He says. Points out who they belong to and where they belong. The third one, the last one, is I exist every day to demonstrate God's love to a broken world. Their purpose is to demonstrate the love of God wherever there's brokenness. So if you were to kind of figure out our demoniac, or what is it, Dennis the demoniac, as I called him here, what would you say his identity was? Having lived in the tombs for so long, having been separated from people for so long, having been in prison for so long, what would you say his identity was? Crazy? Dangerous? Demonized? Where does he belong? He's living with the dead. It's as if he is already dead. What's his purpose? Apparently, to be tortured by the demons, to be tormented and tortured, and to be cast out and to be thrown away. That identity stuck with him for a long time. Until he encounters who? Say it again. Until he encounters who? Because the disciples crossed the sea for him. Because of this event, the people in the town were so frightened that they begged Jesus to leave, not because of the demoniac, because of what they saw Jesus do in this man's life. They were more frightened by a healthy man than they were by a crazed man. Because after they encounter Jesus, after Dennis, the demoniac, encounters Jesus, his identity is now redeemed, rescued, and restored child of God. He's closer, his belonging is now closer to God than it has ever been before. His purpose? Well, Jesus tells him his purpose. It's to be seen and to tell your story. The church, the people had gotten used to his brokenness. It had become their pattern, his pattern. Have you ever gotten used to brokenness? Have you ever gotten used to seeing sickness or illness or just wrongness in our world, in our culture? Have you ever been there? If you have, say, I have. It had become normalized to the point where they just let him be. They kept their distance. And now being made well, being made right, being put in relationship with Jesus, where it changes your identity, where it changes your belonging, where it changes your purpose, it frightened him. Frightened them all. I hear this a lot. Some people say that they are too hopeless, too far away, too broken, too damaged for even the love of God to reach them. Do you have 6,000 demons living inside of you? Do they have 6,000 demons living inside of them? Yeah, most days, right? Jesus comes along and he is for this man. He comes literally across the sea, through the storm, for him. And if he's going to cross the sea and go through the storm for him, what won't he do for you? Church, there are some shackles in our lives that only God's glory and power can break. Remember, Jesus had authority over illness, and he proved it. Jesus had authority over the temple, and he proved it. Jesus had authority over nature, and he proved it. Jesus had supernatural power over demons. He just proved it. Jesus had power over the politics. He's pointing it out. Jesus has power over even evil. But for us, he's willing to cross a sea for you. He's willing to steal a storm for you. He's willing to calm the waters just for you. He will face down an evil army of demons just for you. And that's good news, church. Because we are each mini gospels. We each have a story to tell. Remember the Dennis wanted to follow Jesus. He wanted to get in the boat with Jesus and head on out with him. What did Jesus tell him to do? He said, stay. You have a story to tell here. Stay and say what's happened. He came for him. He'll come for me. Came for him. He's going to come for you. He came for him. He's going to come for me. He came for him, and he's going to come for you. Church, there is no power, no principality, nothing on this earth or in heaven that will ever separate us from the love of God. And Jesus is just one more time showing us that he's willing to venture across and through any and every barrier to let us know that he is for him and he is for us. Is that good news? So here's your application. You're called to do the same thing that the man in the story was called to do. Since we are the redeemed people of God, since we already know the story, since we've already encountered Jesus, since all those things have been going on, we are called now to be witnesses of what God has done, to tell the stories of what God has done, to literally stay where we are and say what God has done and is doing and what you believe he will do in your life. Will you all pray with me?